Good evening and welcome. My name is Jonalyn Woolf-Ivory and I'm the Executive Director for Sno-Isle Libraries, and I would like to welcome you to the Floyd Milgard Center for Sno-Isle Libraries Issues That Matter series. This year, our Issues That Matter theme is exploring public safety. Tonight's community discussion focuses on the public safety and health issues surrounding gun violence. In addition to tonight's presentation, we have a display of the different types of resources that are available through the library. And the display is to my right, and it includes books, DVDs, book lists, and premium databases. We will build later on in the year on the public safety theme with community discussions in September around the topic of bullying, and then later in the year on the topic of driving under the influence and addiction. Please stay tuned on our website for those event dates. The Issues That Matter community discussion series is made possible through the generous support of the Sno-Isle Libraries Foundation. I would like Angelique Leone, the Foundation's Executive Director, and any members of the Foundation or donors of the Library Foundation that are with us tonight to please stand. Okay, thank you. I would also like to recognize the Sno-Isle Libraries Board of Trustees and ask them to stand as well, or to wave their hands. Great. It's always wonderful to have a trustee from your very own neighborhood. So I just wanted to check out tonight to see where everyone's from. So how many of you traveled between 1 mile and 5 miles to show up tonight? Okay. Okay, how about anyone from 5 to 10 miles? Okay, so you had to put a little bit more gas in your car. And how about more than 10 miles? Okay, well, I especially appreciate your willingness to come out on a beautiful May evening, because I think many of us always worry that there's not going to be another nice day. So, thank you. I need to take care of a couple of housekeeping items before we can start tonight. So, in case of an emergency, please be aware of where the exits are. So there's one over that way, and there's one directly in the back. If you have a cell phone, and one to the left. Thank you, Charlie. If you have a cell phone, please silence it or put it on mute. Or if you have a pager, the same, please. And that will minimize distractions to our panelists and also to folks that are sitting next to you. Also, it would be a great time to share your questions and comments till the end of the program so you don't distract your neighbors as well. And finally, I'd like to let you know that we are videotaping tonight's program, and we'll make the video recording available through the Sno-Isle Libraries website and also the YouTube channel. The video may capture some footage showing the audience members, but we're going to do our darndest tonight to avoid capturing audience reactions to different viewpoints that you hear in order to show that Sno-Isle Libraries is neutral on the issues we will be discussing. So at this point, I would like to now introduce Sno-Isle Libraries Board of Trustees and past president, Alana Stone. And Alana will come forward to say a few remarks before she introduces our moderator. Alana?
The only time I'm tall is when I'm after Jonalyn. So, thank you, Jonalyn. Very nice. And I am good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here tonight, both as a trustee of the Sno-Isle Libraries Board, and there are 7 of us. I'm not the only one, so just to be clear. And as a member of the community, I'm happy to be here. The Floyd Norgard Center is a place for our community to gather, and I'm glad that tonight's program is being held here. Tonight, the service which Sno-Isle Libraries gives our communities every day to enable collaborative learning, community discussions, and civic engagement is extended outside our walls to the Norgard Center. Your public library is committed to bringing information, ideas, and people together, so we have exported the library's friendly, neutral atmosphere to this location to provide an environment where individuals who are passionate about one side of the issue can have a reasonable discussion with others just as passionate on another side of the issue. And I think that might describe most of us gathered here tonight, so one way or another. Even though John Lynn has already mentioned them, I too would like to recognize the Sno-Isle Libraries Foundation and their funding sponsorship of issues that matter. The Libraries Foundation provides donor funding which helps bring special smiles to the faces of toddlers and teens, preschoolers and adults throughout the Snohomish and Island County who use the library. And the Foundation's partnership helped make tonight's Issues That Matter community discussions possible. Thank you again, Sno-Isle Libraries Foundation, board members, and donors. Yay. We are honored to have Jack Lowe's as our moderator for tonight's discussion on gun violence. Mr. Lowe's is a 35-year health benefits consultant with Rael and Letson, which are an actuarial and consulting firm in Washington, California, and Colorado. Jack is a former commissioner on the health service system for the city and county of San Francisco. He is past president of the Edmonds Center for the Arts, vice president of the Edmonds Chamber of Commerce, and president of the Hazel Miller Foundation. He is a graduate of Wesleyan University, postgraduate work completed at Wayne State University and San Francisco City College. Jack and his wife, Chris, live in Edmonds and are strongly connected to the Sno-Isle Libraries Foundation. Please give our moderator a round of applause.
How are you all this evening? Good. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. So good evening. I'm honored to be with you tonight to moderate this distinguished panel. I'm interested in this gun violence topic because it has become a systemic issue. From neighborhood to towns to cities to states to the entire country. We have panelists here tonight representing different points of view on public safety and health issues which surround the topic of gun violence. I will go down the line and introduce each panelist, who will in turn provide a brief statement reflecting their position on gun violence and the underlying issues. After we have gone down the line, I will ask some questions I have prepared for the panel, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. As a moderator, I have some instructions for the panel and for you in the audience. We want to hear from each of you, each of our panelists, so I do reserve the right to politely ask panel members to move on if I feel they have sufficiently made their point. I also hope you will forgive me if I cut you off. I will only do this if you're taking too much time. Our panelists have agreed to be on their best behavior and respectful of each other. We want to thank all of our members of the audience in advance for doing the same. Please be respectful of the panelists and the audience members and refrain from boos or cheers or any verbal responses to comments you agree or disagree with. When the time comes for audience questions, here's what I would like you to do. Please write down your question on an index card you were given when you came in, or raise your hand and we'll get you an index card, and then you can give this to the library staff. Write your question down, pass it to the center, and we'll give it to the staff to look at. They'll be collected by the library staff, volunteers. Do we have there's back and back, there's some volunteers, who will be given to our question man, who will attempt to group like questions together. We presume we may have some questions that are similar in nature, so rather than asking the same question twice, we'll try to do that. If we have enough time, you can certainly submit more than one question, and we will try to get as many of your questions during the time available us tonight. So tonight we'll start with the panelist closest to me, Dr. Gary Goldbaum. You can read in this, but I'll read it with you. He serves as health officer and director of the Snohomish Health District and is president of the Snohomish County Medical Board of Trustees, Medical Society Board of Trustees. He's also on the board of Project Access Northwest, a nonprofit working to improve the health care of low-income people. Dr. Goldbaum has worked in public health, family medicine, and epidemiology since 1978. Gary?
Thank you, Jack. Well, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share a public health perspective about gun violence. As a physician, my job has been to learn about my patients and then provide the best guidance and care. As the health officer for Snohomish County, I care for an entire population, over 700,000 patients, each with different health concerns. However, I believe that all of them, including everyone in this room, want to reduce the number of deaths related to gun violence in this country and in this county. I also know that not everyone agrees on how best to do this. So a good starting point and a place where differences of opinion shouldn't be an issue is to learn more about gun violence and who in our community is most affected. First, let's step back and consider the issue in a global context. Strikingly, the gun homicide rate in the United States is 6 times that for Canada, 20 times that for other developed countries on average, but 30 times that for Australia or the United Kingdom. Overall, more than 30,000 U.S. residents are killed every year by guns. In Snohomish County, gun deaths greatly exceed motor vehicle-related deaths, with about 50 people dying each year from gun violence and about 30 on our roads. Each year in the United States, there are about 600 unintentional gun deaths, over 10,000 gun-related homicides, and about 20,000 suicides. Since 2007, 4 out of 5 gun deaths in Snohomish County have been ruled suicides, and half of all suicides have been gun deaths. Although homicide rates per 100,000 population were lower in Snohomish County than for the rest of the state and for the nation as a whole, suicide rates were higher here than for the rest of the state or the country. Before I talk more about homicides and suicides, which represent the most common gun violence, I want to talk about unintentional gun injuries. In Snohomish County, we average less than 1 such death each year, but these always get our attention. These are deaths and injuries that result when unsupervised children and loaded guns wind up in the same place, as tragically happened here in Stanwood last year, or when a hunter mistakes another person for the game he seeks. In times past, we might call these accidental injuries and deaths. However, accidental suggests randomness or fate. These injuries and deaths are neither random nor inevitable. They are simply unintentional and are preventable. Now let's look more closely at the most common victims of gun violence. Gun homicide and suicide victims are overwhelmingly male everywhere, including in Snohomish County. For homicide, males outnumber females 5-1, and for suicide, 8-1. In many ways, though, the similarity ends there. In Snohomish County, homicide disproportionately affects young people, with rates peaking between ages 18 and 24. Blacks have a homicide rate that is 5 times the county average. South Everett has the highest murder rate in the county. Suicide is very different, an almost opposite picture. Suicide rates climb steadily with age and are highest in elderly men, although common across all ages. Suicide rates are highest among Native Americans and whites. The communities to the east along Highway 2 have the highest suicide rate in the county. Gun violence is a public health problem. The good news about public health problems is that time and again they have proven to be fixable. In a recent editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, Drs. Hemingway and Miller pointed out that public health approaches dramatically reduced injuries and deaths due to motor vehicle crashes and could have the same impact on gun violence. Public health approaches focus on populations rather than individuals and use data to drive policy decisions. Such approaches aim to prevent rather than to remedy. They create systems in which it is more difficult to make mistakes and where mistakes do not lead to serious injury. Above all, public health approaches consider all possible interventions and engage the entire community to solve complex problems such as gun violence. Public health approaches emphasize shared responsibility rather than blame. The success in reducing motor vehicle injuries and deaths reflects multiple interventions: safer cars, safer roads, driver safety training, graduated licensing, widespread use of seat belts, stronger and better enforced drunk driving laws, and better emergency response to crashes. I believe that we can reduce gun violence. To do so, we first need better data about what works and then a collective commitment to such evidence-based interventions. For example, to address every type of gun violence, we need strategies to assure that guns are securely stored and that guns have features to reduce theft, misuse, and unintentional discharge. We also need to better understand what broad public policies are effective and should be part of a comprehensive public health approach. Without a doubt, we also need a much greater focus on mental health. Suicide is among the top 10 leading causes of death in Snohomish County, and it has been identified by our Public Health Advisory Council as one of the top 3 health issues for the community to address. And earlier this year, the Snohomish County Board of Health adopted a resolution urging the state legislature to take action to reduce gun violence. The resolution emphasized that more resources for mental health services were critical. However, beyond mental health services, we also need broad community awareness about mental health so that all of us can recognize and help those at risk for suicide. There is no better time than now to begin to treat gun violence as a fixable rather than an inevitable community problem. Indeed, the Public Health Advisory Council is seeking community members to help develop public health approaches to suicide. You can visit our website at snohd, that's snohd.org, to learn more. So it's been my privilege to share these thoughts with you. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Second to speak tonight to us is Joe Valentine from North Sound Mental Health Administration. He's the Executive Director of North Sound Mental Health Administration. Try to say that fast several times. He's credited with numerous innovations in social services during his more than 30 years in human service leadership. The administration coordinates and funds public mental health services in Snohomish, Island, Skagit, San Juan, and Whatcom counties. I'm pleased to present to you Joe Valentine.
Good evening. Like Dr. Goldbaum, I appreciate the opportunity to provide some accurate information to the community about the relationship between mental illness and gun violence. And unfortunately, there has been a great deal of misinformation about this relationship, so I do appreciate the opportunity to, to provide some research information. So I'm going to make 3 key points. I'll tell you up front what the headlines are for my speech. Point number 1. Persons with mental illness are no more likely to commit gun violence than anyone else, and in fact, persons with mental illness are more likely to be victims of gun violence or commit suicide than to be perpetrators of gun violence. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, there are known strategies and programs that we know about that can help persons with mental illness in their recovery so that it reduces the likelihood that they will harm themselves or others. So that's my second point. My third point is that by over-focusing on mental illness as the cause for gun violence, All we're doing is increasing the stigma that's already associated with mental illness, thereby discouraging people from mental illness and seeking treatment. So we're actually making the problem worse. So let me return to my first point. There's actually been a lot of research conducted looking at the correlation between mental illness and violence. And these studies have consistently shown that mental illness alone is not statistically related to violence. One of the most widely respected studies was the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study. They actually went into specific neighborhoods and they compared the prevalence of violence between people with mental illness and other people in the same neighborhood, and they found no correlation between mental illness and violence. What they did find is that there is a correlation with substance abuse. And so people with mental illness who may also have substance abuse, as well as other people with substance abuse, are much more likely to engage in violence than the average person. In fact, studies of violence have identified the main risk factors for violence as being young, male, single, and from a lower socioeconomic status. And the most relevant factors for predicting future violence are having less than a high school education, growing up with a history of violence in their family, being involved with the juvenile justice system, perceiving hidden threats from others, or being in a situation where there's family divorce or separation. So those factors are much more likely to be associated with violence than mental illness. And I'll return to an important point that Dr. Goldbaum made, that really suicides account for over 60% of all firearm fatalities. And suicide is the third leading cause of death in Americans aged 15 to 24, which is also the time when people go off to college, join the military, and experience their first major episode of mental illness. The majority of suicide victims have identified mental health problems. And one study found that the risk for violence and psychotic illnesses is highest in the early course of the illness, before people have been diagnosed as having a mental illness. So that's my first point. But the second point is that there are things that we can do to support people with mental illness. Has nothing to do with gun violence, but it's stuff that we can do to help people in the recovery. And I'll just share two of those strategies with you. The first is early identification and treatment for children and youth who are beginning to show signs of mental illness. One study estimated that 20% of youth have some form of mental illness that deserves treatment. And many of the mental health disturbances that cause pain and family misery start at the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24 years. So there's an incubation period for mental illness. In the North Sound region, in the 5 counties of the North Sound region, the proportion of youth between the ages of 16 and 20 have a higher rate of psychiatric hospitalization than any other age group. According to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, there is an average of 8 to 10 years between the onset of the symptoms of mental illness and when people actually begin to receive treatment. Early identification and treatment could play a significant role in reducing the likelihood that young people with mental illness will end up hurting themselves or others. One of the other strategies that is being employed across the country is called mental health first aid. Mental health first aid provides training to teachers and other persons in the community, including youth themselves, on how to recognize the early signs of mental illness and assist persons through an emotional crisis. And in our region, we're teaming up with Compass Health to actually fund the training of trainers who can go out to the community and provide mental health first aid training. And I'll be providing that information to the Sno-Isle Library so that they can distribute it. Here's a second strategy, though, and that is that there is now a lot of research about using treatment methods that recognize the role that trauma plays in mental illness, One of the leading causes of mental illness is trauma that people experienced when they're younger. And one of the key factors is experience of trauma at an early age, whether it's growing up in a family of abuse, or growing up with poverty, or growing up in a neighborhood of violence. There's a body of research that talks about the impact of adverse early childhood circumstances. There is a lot of research now that shows for young children, growing up in those situations literally affects their brain chemistry. It alters their brain chemistry and alters their neurological ability to cope with stress. So treatment methods that recognize the role of trauma and don't increase the trauma when we interact with people who need help is an important factor. My last point, that over-focusing on mental illness as the cause for gun violence will not reduce the incidence of gun violence, but it will increase the stigma that people face. And this is very unfortunate because I just talked about the importance of getting young people to recognize the need for help and to get help. But if we stigmatize mental illness even more, it's simply going to discourage the very group that we want to get help from getting help. Thank you.
Next on our panel, Sergeant Barry. I'm Barry going to screw this up again. I do it every time.
Go for it.
Recti.
Got it.
Yeah. Stanwood Police Department. Sergeant Barry has been in public safety for 25 years, oversees the night shift for Stanwood Police Department. He sits on this panel to educate residents about existing gun laws and procedures relating to gun violence. He is joined by Peggy, is Peggy here? Peggy Gerard?
She's in the back.
And Deborah Sousa. Peggy, I talked to on the phone several times, and she was a great help in connecting everything together, so thank you. Shout out to Peggy. Who processed concealed pistol licenses and pistol transfer applications for the Stanwood Police Department. Barry?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you coming in here when it's so nice out there, and to listen to all of us. Obviously, our approach is completely different from the gentleman on either side of me. They provide resources for us because we're the first responders that go out and deal with this incident that occurs, whether it's a potential violent crime, has the potential to be a violent crime. Our job when we get there is to de-escalate whatever's happening. And like with any relationship, whether it's husband-wife, boyfriend-girlfriend, buddies, neighbors, people tend to have heated and very agitated discussions that can lead to these types of things that they're talking about that could become violent crimes. So our job as a first responder is when we get there is that de-escalation, and that's through communication, which in a lot of cases anymore doesn't happen anymore. Most communication is done by texting or email. The ability for people to talk to people isn't as much as it used to be. So that's our job, is to talk to these people and to get them back to a relative level to where they can communicate with us and we can communicate with them and find out what type of help that they need. Mental health in regards to Compass Health has been a huge help to us. It's a resource that we can take these people to so they can start getting the help that they need right away. You talk about the 14 to 24-year-old people. We see those kids in our high schools all the time. We've seen it in the news with these kids in the high schools all the time. So one of the things that we do also is with our school resource officers that we have throughout the county, as well as now we have a school security unit. One of the big things there is counseling and mentoring. Not pushing those troubled kids aside, but trying to figure out what's wrong with them and see what we can do to help them. Kind of get them back on the path of that mental health on the good side, that they're starting to not be pushed aside. They're not becoming those loners. They're not the problem that they think they are or the problem that they think they should be because of the background that they have. So as first responders, the biggest important thing that we can do is communicate. And that's how we've tried, one, to get everything to de-escalate, figure out what they need, and get them that help. We can only get them so far, and then these gentlemen here and their organizations are where things start to get better. As I mentioned with our school resource officers, they mentor these kids all the time, and it's made a huge improvement. When we show up somewhere, there's a huge impact just because we're there. We're authority. In most situations like this, that's the last person anybody wants to see is somebody with authority. So again, it comes in how we address the problem. Every action gets an opposite or equal reaction. So again, it comes back to how we deal with it. By dealing with it in the manner that it should be done, we can do our best to reduce gun violence or any other type of violence. As I stated before, we're reactive. There's no plan, there's nobody that calls us that says this is when this is going to happen. So we can get there and be proactive and stop it. We have to get there and stop it after it's already occurred. So I'm looking forward to what else we have to talk about tonight and what questions you may have for me, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you. I'm going to encourage you once again to start writing questions down and passing them so we can get the questions up in front to be looked at. So please take a second as you think about this and as I drone on for a minute to plan your question and get it down so we can deal with that. Thank you. Our fourth panelist is Representative Dave Hayes, serving his first term as representing the 10th Legislative District, which encompasses all of Allen County and parts of Snohomish and Skagit counties. He is a sergeant with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and is a past president of the Washington Council of Police and Sheriffs. Dave?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. Thank you for everybody for giving up such a lovely evening to come out and participate in this. I certainly look forward to hearing everybody's questions and concerns. I'm just finishing my first legislative session, having just been elected this past fall. So I kind of tried to hit the ground running, and this issue of gun violence and gun control was definitely a very hot topic, as I'm sure most of you probably know during this legislative session. And what I was asked to do tonight was to talk with you guys about what legislation was introduced, and hopefully take some questions and have some interaction regarding that legislation and what happened with it. When we're down in Olympia, I have kind of come to recognize that there's a few different types of legislation when it comes down to considering gun violence or gun control issues. There's the reactive type of gun control issues and sentencing, regarding sentencing standards for people who do commit crimes with guns. What happens after the crime, and there's also some proactive legislation out there that comes from the work studies that are created by certain pieces of legislation. You're going to hear me talk a little bit about those different types of work studies that were generated this year. So this year in the legislature, there was a little over 30 pieces of legislation regarding gun control or gun violence. And only 2 or 3 pieces of those legislation actually made it through the entire process and were signed by the governor. So I'll kind of start talking a little bit about these pieces of legislation. And I don't have them necessarily in any particular order. I just kind of went through the computer and typed them in as they came. So the first one was Senate Bill 5737 by Senator Murray, and this is a gun control bill. It would make it illegal to manufacture, sell, or possess assault weapons. And this particular piece of legislation had a very detailed list or definition of what is an assault weapon. when it comes down to the different features that any particular weapon may have, or any particular gun may have. The second one is Senate Bill 5282. This is one that creates a work group, and the work group would have had to have made recommendations regarding mental health issues and privacy issues coming out of that, to make recommendations to the mental health professionals and law enforcement when it comes down to how to deal with those type of folks and regarding weapons possession. Both of those the first bill that I mentioned failed to get a hearing. This second bill, 5292 by Senator Carroll, was signed by the governor just last week. So these work groups that we're talking about are studies that motivate recommendations by the people back to the legislature and back to the professionals doing the job. There was another piece of legislation by Senator Klein that creates the crime of allowing an unauthorized minor to access a firearm. And when I started considering bills like that, there was 2 or 3 different bills that were similar to that, that legislators brought kind of in reaction to the issue that happened here in Stanwood, and the one that was just a couple weeks after that down in Tacoma. And I started considering the laws that are already in place that address that same issue. So there's also a bill that would create a program through the Superintendent of Public Instruction to have firearms safety classes and K-12 in our local public schools. There's another task force improving public safety regarding firearms to examine the suicide rates and accidental rates. This is another work group bill. There was a bill here about mental health court and making it so people participating in the mental health courts would not have access to weapons during the duration that they were participating in the mental health courts. Mental health courts in Snohomish County are very new. I believe they just came up last year. And so that's fairly new. Something that's operated through Snohomish County District Courts. Another bill by Senator Murray that would allow local jurisdictions to restrict weapons in parks and local recreation facilities. That bill is another one that did not receive a hearing and ultimately did not pass. There's a law that creates the ability for local sheriffs and police chiefs to accept weapons on a temporary basis. So it would allow somebody to go into the police department or sheriff's office and surrender their weapon for up to 30 days. And what I'd like to point out on that particular one, this is a service that's largely already available, at least here locally in Snohomish County. And it probably comes down to the resources of the individual jurisdiction. Smaller jurisdictions like Island County may not have the ability to provide a service like that. Here's another House bill here that would enhance the sentencing standards for somebody who commits the crime of drive-by shooting. Another one regarding possession of illegal possession of a firearm. Possession of a firearm while a member of a criminal street gang or an associate of a criminal street gang. There's one that creates a firearm safety program paid for by levying additional taxes and fees on firearms and ammunition sales. And this particular bill would have created a program through the local departments of health, and the revenue that they receive from those taxes and fees would go to fund that program. And allow them to do firearm safety classes and prevention issues. Another bill that I actually assisted in co-sponsoring with Representative Hurst was House Bill 1096. And this bill creates a sentencing enhancement for juveniles that are found in possession of weapons. And this bill was largely meant to get in there early on with juveniles that would commit crimes with guns. And it would have mandated a 10-day detention on their first offense of committing a crime with a weapon, or with a firearm specifically. There's a bill here prohibiting the possession of a firearm by a person subject to protection orders. So in this particular bill, when you're thinking about somebody who's subject to a protection order, oftentimes these are folks who are in a possible domestic violence situation. They go to the court commissioner and ask them for a domestic violence no contact order. And what you have to do when you get a domestic violence no contact order, for those of you who don't know, you have to go in and swear out an affidavit, whether it's the male or female party in the relationship, and they swear out an affidavit and ask the commissioner for a no contact order. And with this particular legislation, this would allow the commissioner to require that the respondent in that order have to turn in their weapons and turn in their concealed pistol license and not possess any weapons. So that kind of comes down to some other possible constitutional issues regarding due process. So that bill may end up having some problems. It ended up not passing. So there's another bill here by Representative Pike out of Vancouver that would have allowed school employees, teachers, to possess weapons in our schools. That bill ended up not getting a hearing. And the bill that you probably heard the most about, thank you, was House Bill 1588, and that was the universal background check bill. It would have mandated a background check on any private transfer, whether it's a sale or a gift. And the last bill that I want to talk about real quick is House Bill 1612, because this is the bill that I also co-sponsored along with Representative Hope, and it creates a firearms offender registry that's kept by the Washington State Patrol. And upon conviction, the judge that's convicting that person would put this firearm offender on the registry list, and it would allow law enforcement to go back and check up on this person to make sure that they're not possessing weapons. So I look forward to your questions.
I'm going to ask you for a favor, and the favor is, the topic tonight is gun violence. There have been a number of pieces of discussion of things that are legislatively organized towards gun control, and that's not the topic tonight. It's a topic for another time and another place, and we welcome you to do that at another time and another place. But tonight we want to stick with looking at how we deal with the issue of violence, and I would appreciate if we can stay to that forum. While we're sorting questions, I had a couple of questions I was going to ask, and Joe, I'll start with you, and I guess it's the question, well, you and I talked about this question because it's the question I think a lot of people think about, and that is, when someone commits a crime with gun violence involved in it, commits gun violence, mass shootings, whatever it might be, can't we just make the presumption these people are mentally ill?
So we're starting with the easy questions, huh? The short answer based on research is no. Just because somebody commits gun violence, even some of the more horrific incidents of mass violence, does not mean that they have a mental illness. Mental illness is a very specific condition, just like physical illness, that has specific symptoms and specific causes. Does a person who commit gun violence or mass violence, is that person disturbed? Yes, they're deeply disturbed. And there could be many reasons for that. They could have grown up in a family of violence, they could have drug addiction, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a mental illness. Thank you.
Gary, a question for you on the last part of your presentation. I want to get back to it so I'm sure that I look at it correctly. You talked about the fact that the Public Health Advisory Council is seeking community members to help develop public health approaches to suicide. How does somebody get involved? And what would the council expect of people from the community as far as dealing with those issues?
So it's a great question. This is a new approach to public health. This isn't about what government does to or for people. It's actually about what a community does for itself. And so what we're trying to do is to get together the folks in the community who are interested, have the resources to bring forward to address a number of public health issues. Suicide is one that's been identified by the Public Health Advisory Council. And to very specifically organize those folks, get the best of their ideas together, their understanding of what's going on in the community, a collective understanding of what might be effective in the community, and then to have everyone in the community, different organizations and individuals, actually commit to working together towards that common goal. And that's a different strategy than in the past. So how to get involved? Check the website at snohd.org. That's a great place to find out more about this whole process, and if you're interested, it gives you some contact information.
Great, thank you. How are we doing for questions? Oh, there's one. Question is there any program in the U.S. that has shown a decrease in gun violence? I'll ask anybody that might know that at the panel. Is there any program in the U.S. that has shown a decrease in gun violence?
I could kind of start it out a little bit, I guess.
If you would, Dave.
The last bill that I discussed regarding was House Bill 1812. Is modeled after some legislation from Virginia, I believe, and maybe Washington, D.C., where the city of Baltimore created a firearms offender registry much like this. And it allowed their local police officers the ability to focus on specific individuals who have shown a propensity to gun violence in the past. And this is just one part of probably an overall program that they had in that local jurisdiction to reduce gun violence. Because if we focus on the people who have committed crimes with guns in the past, that's a pretty good indicator of future behavior is past behavior. So that's what this legislation was geared toward, and it'll just give folks like myself and Sergeant Rucky better resources at the local level to fight the criminal element.
Anyone else on that topic? Yes, please.
So an example of a program that's well known to be effective is lockbox programs, and these have been studied in a number of different areas, including in King County, where if you get lockboxes into households with guns, and if those lockboxes are used, you reduce the likelihood that a gun will be misused in that household. So there are examples of some programs. We don't have enough good data about what works at a policy level, things like what about universal gun checks? That's a policy kind of question. And we don't have enough good data to really address how effective those kinds of programs are.
Thank you. We talked about this a little bit beforehand in a couple of areas. One, Gary talked about it in terms of looking at the community involvement in public sector. Dave talked about it in relationship to some of the legislation which seems to bring out the issue of having studies done in particular areas done by professionals in that area. The question that comes to us is, how does the community begin to deal with gun violence and find solutions? Anybody got a good idea? Please.
I'll dive right in. I think that dealing with any of these complex problems, it starts with the entire community agreeing that it's a problem. And then the next step is to try and identify where we've got the resources to start to bring to bear, and to identify what kind of intervention strategies are going to make the most sense. That takes a lot of work to get to that place. I've got to say, in my heart, I believe that the place we have to start is with our youth. And for me, the first effort is to try and increase the understanding among youth about mental illness, especially about depression, and to help destigmatize, as Joe was saying, and increase the ability of our youth in particular to recognize depression among their peers and to help get their peers into effective counseling and to get the help that they need.
And I also take a stab at that. Well, one of the things that we know from research is that persons who commit violence are much more likely to have grown up in a family of violence, whether victims of child abuse or they've witnessed domestic violence. And there's a lot of research now that children who are exposed to domestic violence, that we need to have programs in place that help those children cope with that experience, because otherwise they're internalizing that as a learned behavior. So that is something I think we can do in a very preventative way.
Great, thank you. A question that probably Barry, in your role as a sergeant, and Dave, in your role as not a legislature later, but as a sheriff, the question comes: where can the public learn skills to help defuse situations? I guess the better question is that where we should be diffusing situations, in the public, or should we be leaving it to the professionals?
I'll go ahead and start, Dave. I think that the ability to start diffusing what's going on in the community starts at home. Starts with, especially if at the younger level, where you've got kids that are interacting with other kids that are coming from those type of homes where the violence occurs, and to where there's an understanding of what's going on and open communication about what's going on. Because you go with what these gentlemen provide and what their resources within the mental health community provides. There's a lot of resources out there, but it has to start at home, and it has to start out with your kids' friends. Everybody has to be able to talk to each other and recognize if there's a problem. And in the 30 years that I've been doing this, most cases, when they do recognize it, they ignore it. Well, that doesn't fix it.
So from the law enforcement standpoint, I think Barry addressed part of the community issue there. From the law enforcement standpoint, the police officers go through training at the basic academy and after the academy in critical incident stress management. There was a bill that went through this year that ended up not passing that would have provided additional resources at our academy to train our police officers in how to deal with people, not just people with mental illness, but people who are just under a great amount of stress, and dealing with that to lower the propensity of a police officer having to take more harsh measures to deal with a situation, or possibly even take the person's life. While that bill itself failed, I also helped file an amendment to the budget to keep the funding that would have affected that bill in our academy. But the budget still hasn't passed, so it's something that we're still working on.
Thank you. Joe, I have a question. What is being done to reduce the stigma I'm not sure, but regarding mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment?
So there's actually a lot that goes on. There's actually a lot of information available about mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment. And I talked about one of the programs that we're beginning to fund called Mental Health First Aid. And this actually started in Australia, where they realized, just like we teach people first aid for physical things, you can teach people first aid in terms of recognizing when somebody has an emotional or mental health crisis. And there are some simple things that you can do. As the sergeant indicated and Representative Hayes, there are a lot of programs available already. And one of the things that happens with youth is because of the stigma, there's stigma attached to people getting that help. And that's why I'm so concerned about the way the media has handled this whole issue, because it's adding to that stigma more. But I really think it's up to, I think the sergeant talked that it starts at the family. And I think that's true, that parents need to recognize and be willing to recognize if their child needs help and get help in terms of trying to get that child to help.
Thank you. It's right on top of that is another question talking about mental health first aid. And the question goes on, what is the level of cooperation from the leadership in the local school districts in doing this? And do we need more funding, emphasis on giving educators more funds to do that?
So we've just started it, so I'm assuming we'll get good cooperation from the schools. We do have some funding for it. It's not that expensive of a program. I think the real issue is people having an open mind and being willing to recognize that training on mental health issues is the same as training on physical health issues. I think it's really changing the mindset that's the most important thing.
Thank you. David, it was a question for you, and it says there have been a number of cases in which women have been killed by their partners in spite of an order of protection. It goes on to talk a little bit about some legislative issues, but the consideration is what steps can be taken to guarantee a woman's safety. And I don't know that's a question that you can answer, but I'll ask you of it anyway.
Well, I'll try, and maybe Barry can even supplement my answer a little bit, or my response a little bit. I think that no piece of paper, no contact order is going to protect a person from being a victim of a crime. That's still just a reactionary issue when it comes down to a no contact order, or even a violation of a no contact order is still a reaction. The person that's most responsible to protect that victim is frankly herself and the other people around her. If it is actually a female victim, it does go both ways. More often than not, it is a female victim. But that person needs to take steps to protect themselves and reach out for the resources that are available, whether it be through local law enforcement and family and other social networks to get the protection that they need. Would you add anything to that, Bear?
Well, you hit it right on the head. There is no guarantee. It's not possible. We can't be there 24/7. The problem with this is most people, and male or female, that have a protection order or a no contact order believe that piece of paper will protect them without using the resources or their family or themselves. So Dave hit it right on the head there. They have to believe that they have to have some involvement in their own protection. And that includes having us respond to things that occur regarding that order when it happens, not 3 hours later, not a couple days later. And then when we do respond and we do take law enforcement action, those people have to follow up with it, and that includes in the prosecution aspect of it. So there's some resolve to what happened.
Thank you. Some of the questions we're getting, folks, are not questions. They're statements, and I'm having a difficulty finding where I can put the question mark on them. So we're working on that issue too, to try to make questions out of sometimes non-questions. I have a question. I do have a question. Why is gun violence different from other forms of social violence like drunk driving, drug abuse, and family violence, domestic disturbance, especially when we understand drunk drivers kill nearly 5 times as many people each year as are killed by gun violence?
I could start with that. It's just the fact that it comes up with gun violence. That in itself is violent to anyone and everyone. Everyone fears that, especially when you look at the great things that have happened in the aspect of gun violence with the mass killings that happen just at random. Everybody hears about drunk driving and it's a problem. But gun violence scares people to death. And they want it solved. They don't want to be one of those people in the mall when somebody loses it and goes crazy with a gun. They think that with a DUI, if they see somebody coming, well, they can get out of their way. Or the odds are they've gone by a DUI and didn't even know it. But guns scare people. So that's why it's much more prevalent and people want something done about it.
Yes.
I need to correct something here, that motor vehicle deaths, there are fewer motor vehicle deaths than there are gun deaths in this county each year. So that was an incorrect statement that was said, that more people are dying due to motor vehicle crashes than guns. But besides that, I think it's really important to recognize this is a public health problem. It can be approached, just as we have dramatically reduced the number of deaths due to tobacco or due to motor vehicle crashes. We can reduce the number of deaths due to gun violence. It can be done. Not simple answers, but it is approachable.
Anyone else?
Well, and just as our conversation earlier back in the kitchen, we talked about, what are we classifying as gun violence? And I think here in this conversation tonight, we've really classified gun violence as any life taken with a gun, whether that be suicide or a homicide. And so when it comes down to the issue of gun violence, both of those issues are addressed there in the issue of gun violence. There's suicide and homicide. So, are we addressing the criminal aspect of it, the civil aspect of it, or the suicide aspect of it? And civil being, sometimes a homicide is sometimes done legally, whether it be by a law enforcement officer or a private citizen. There are types of homicide that are legal. So, and I think that's important for the public to understand.
This sort of comes right on top of that when it says there seems to be a perception that gun violence is increasing in America when the data shows gun violence is dramatically down over the past 2 decades. What may contribute to this misperception? Is it? Go ahead, please. Thank you.
That's absolutely correct. The number of gun deaths each year is declining. What captures our attention, of course, are the mass shootings, the tragedies of even the individual child. So we're far more aware these days about all of these tragedies. Indeed, deaths due to firearms in schools have been declining for decades, despite the fact that we hear about the mass shootings. So clearly there are changes afoot. I think that we can continue to move those changes forward and reduce the number of deaths even further. Again, from a public health perspective, I look at the data. Suicides are a greater problem than homicides are, certainly here in Snohomish County. And that's where we need to invest our energy to reduce any kind of deaths, but certainly gun deaths that result in suicides.
The other half of the question is, someone said, are there any statistics for non-fatal gun violence? And how do those statistics fit in?
So there certainly are statistics. We don't have great data about what happens in the outpatient setting. There are folks who may have a gun-related injury and it never gets reported because someone is seen in a doctor's office or never even goes to a doctor's office. So we really only have data about those cases that show up in emergency departments, end up in hospitalizations, or of course end up in deaths. It may be that law enforcement has more information, but even there, again, not all of these unintentional kinds of injuries are going to be reported and brought to our attention. So the data are somewhat limited, and they are certainly skewed by the most serious injuries that end up in emergency departments. What we know is that there are far more injuries than there are deaths, and certainly that applies to both suicides and to assaults compared to homicides.
What programs do the Sno-Isle counties have in place to keep youth busy and to keep it away from drugs and gangs? Well, one of them is probably the library. You've got a lot of services. Libraries here and there, and you've got programs built for those kids to do stuff. And it is an important factor. I'm a great champion of that. Anybody else have anything? Are there other programs that you see out there that I presume we're looking at Boys and Girls Clubs and organizations like that are trying to work with youth? The problem is how do sometimes you get people involved and how do you get them there? One of the questions, as part of this also, is where are the parents of our at-risk youth? And it probably is an unanswerable question also. That if they're not there, they're not there. Whether they should be is a whole different story. There probably are some parents it's better that they're not there. It's true. You know, from that standpoint. The question is the public educated to the cause of gun violence?
Well, this public certainly is tonight. I would argue we're not well enough educated, and we are sorely lacking in the information that we need to make good decisions about how to address any of these issues. I just have to share with you, as a physician, as a scientist, I am appalled that research has been suppressed in this country, research examining the issues of violence, and in particular, violence related to firearms. Actually, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is charged with understanding what's going on in our communities here in the United States, was prohibited by Congress from actually exploring the issue of gun-related violence. I think that makes it difficult for us to make informed decisions. We shouldn't fear what the data have to tell us. I've acknowledged to you already tonight that the big issue for me as a public health practitioner is about suicide. It's not about the unintentional injuries. Those are tragic, and I care about them, and I think we can do something about them. But frankly, they don't represent the majority of the deaths or the injuries.
I'd like to go back to the issue of parents, if we could, for a second. We talked about where are the parents. But you know, in the broader social services system, we haven't always done a good job in the past of helping the parents. And there's more and more research about models, and we're trying to use them here, of really working with the parents as partners, as equal partners in dealing with their child, and not necessarily looking down on the parent because they're seeking treatment. So I think there is more that we can do to empower parents to be co-equals in providing treatment and help to their children. A lot of parents, they simply don't know what to do. They're at their rope's end, and I think we just have to be more effective in engaging those parents and teaching them skills so that they realize that there are things that they can do.
Thank you. I've got some of the cards have multiple questions, and I'll try to go through other people's before I come back and answer everybody's at all of them at one time. This question is a comment with a question attached to it. My research from about 8 years ago showed that one common factor in all school shootings across the country was the perception of the shooters had been, the perpetrators of the shootings have been bullied. Is that still a common factor in school shootings?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the research.
All right.
I haven't dug into that.
Joe, this goes back to that pretty much the question I asked you at the very beginning, but it says, were any of the shooters at high-profile mass shootings, Columbia, Virginia Tech, et cetera, not mentally ill? Do you have a feeling that mentally ill should have uninfringed access to firearms? I don't need to answer the last part of it. But is there any sense that, as you talked before about the relationship with mental illness and shootings is not necessarily what's out there?
Well, there's been a lot of armchair diagnosticians, people reading the media and thinking that they can arrive at a diagnosis of mental illness, but that's a very specific condition. And I think the research shows that persons who commit mass shootings, are they disturbed? Yes. But it isn't necessarily due to mental illness. It'd be more likely due to growing up in a family of violence themselves or being victims of violence themselves rather than being mental illness. But there has been a lot of stuff in the media where the media has tried to speculate about the person's condition. Only a licensed clinician or psychiatrist could arrive at those decisions.
We've got a couple more questions. One of them is asking Barry and Dave in his police role, would you please elaborate on proactive actions of police system to reduce gun violence?
Wow, that's a good question.
We talked a little bit about that at the very beginning, that you're sort of in a reactive position to do that.
It's very much reactive.
The only one I know is proactive is that television show where the guy knows ahead what something's going to happen and
Exactly.
he's able to get there and prevent a crime. Now, if you guys could do that,
I could have retired a while ago.
Well, when we're talking about prevention, are we talking about preventing crime, criminal acts from occurring, or are we talking about the other type of gun violence and preventing suicides from occurring? One thing that I can say is every time a law enforcement officer shows up on the scene of somebody who's suicidal, probably 99% of the time, that officer is successful in diffusing the situation and getting that person the services that they need to prevent that suicide and hopefully prevent future episodes of threatened suicide. When it comes down to preventing crime, there are so many intangibles there that we just simply can't get to. Frankly, our presence and the proactivity that comes down to the criminal side of it is largely directed towards simply our presence and our experience and knowing our communities. So, we've had a couple of great examples of that here recently, where proactive police work has led to the prevention of a crime or at least helping solve the crime.
And some of the things that Dave's touching on is, like, here in Stanwood, we have a program that's called Our Most Harmful Criminals. We target these people. We know who they are. We know what they do. We know where they like to play. So we are kind of the monkey on their back. We do everything we can do to deter them from doing what they do. We also have in the sheriff's office what we call our directed patrol unit. They target people that we know and what they do. That's the only time that we can really be proactive, is when we're going after the known. The unknown stuff, there just isn't anything that we can do other than be very visible in as many places as often as possible.
And if I can expand on that just a little bit, one of the focuses that I wanted to bring down to Olympia was the issue of school violence. After the Sandy Hook tragedy and the others that have happened more recently in our history, that was something that after talking to several teachers locally, they don't get a lot of training. They're mandated by state law to have, I believe it's 5 or 6 fire alarm drills every year, but they only had to do 2 shelter-in-place drills. They call them shelter-in-place, something that Barry and I would usually refer to as active shooter. But I keep coming back to the exact same point. The thing that's going to help our schools remain safe, and when we start having the discussion of having armed teachers and stuff like that, I don't personally believe that that's the route to go. I believe that police officers in school is the way to go with this. And Snohomish County is doing a fantastic job with that. Here in Stanwood, we have 1 school resource officer that spreads himself out through all the different schools, and the sheriff's office just started a school services unit. So having police officers in our schools, I think, pays great dividends, not just towards school safety, but towards education, towards prevention of future crime and children getting into crimes. It comes down to mentoring the child with the presence of the law enforcement officer, and I just think it pays such better benefits than just the safety aspect of it.
thank you. I've got an interesting question. Do you officers see a pattern between foul language from youth 12 to 15 to DUI, driving with a suspended license, and violence? Would foul language-free zones on school property help?
Wow. I never even conceived that.
No, I've never put those together before.
Okay, with that. One thing that is brought up here, violent video games and movies are desensitizing people. Should not these instigators be addressed? And I think that's been a topic where we've talked about the violence on television, the violence in movie theaters. I think all those are issues that probably have been discussed. Is there any, do you want to comment on it? Anybody? Go ahead.
Again, this is an area where there is active research, and the research is very mixed at this time. I think that it deserves much more research to try and clarify. First, do violent videos and such lead to increased violence among individuals? We just actually don't have enough information right now to really make a clear commitment one way or another. We need more research.
Anyone else? We've dealt with this. The question comes up, but I think we have dealt with it to a great extent, and that is the statistics on gun violence, suicides, and accidents. I think Gary addressed this specifically for the area here in the Snohomish County area. There was a question about how it applies particularly to Stanwood, and I don't know if anybody has individual statistics that you'd have off the top of your head of the number of violent crimes or gun deaths or anything in Stanwood itself. And I don't know that'd be indicative of more than just the local community as opposed to everything. Do you?
For Stanwood, it's really minimal. People give me a hard time because I always refer to working in Mayberry.
Nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing. I've been in the county for 30 years. And here is this community, because this community has a sense of community. They really care about home. They care about where they live. Our violent crime in this city is minimal. The stuff that has happened in the last couple of years, very tragic death of a child, was a very unfortunate accident. But you folks and those of you that live on Camino Island, we live in a great community. People care about where they live, they care about their neighbors. I always joke about I can drive through town and everybody waves to me with all 5 fingers. You don't get that everywhere. It's a sense of community. People care. And I thank you for that.
Last question I've got is there a relationship between psychotic drugs being given to young people for depression and violence? I don't know, maybe that's something, Joe, that you could...
I don't know why, no, I don't know why that connection would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gary? I've got a couple minutes left. If anybody in the panel wants to say any concluding remarks, I'm more than willing to have you say them. So anybody have a concluding comment? Or have we concluded? Yes, Gary.
First, I appreciate that all of you took time out to come and listen to us, but also to share your questions. I really appreciate that the community cares. And I think that's where solutions start, where a community cares enough to learn about what's going on and then potentially commits to doing something about it. That'll make a huge difference. You've already heard here that the solutions are not simple. None of us on the panel suggested there were easy approaches to any of this. But I'm personally convinced that if we start at every level, if we're working at the family, at the very beginnings of life, in our schools, and then up into adulthood, and into our seniors. Remember, suicide risk is greater among those who are older. So at every age, if we as communities are taking an active interest and committing to doing something about it, I think that change can come.
Anyone else? Well, I want to thank our panel. It's been a great opportunity for everyone. So thanks to Gary, to Joe, to Barry, to Dave for taking the time to come and talk with you all, and thank you all for listening. The civil discourse on issues that matter is what makes America what it is. Our thanks to the Sno-Isle Libraries Board and library staff for hosting the opportunity for safe, meaningful, and respectful dialogue in this important topic. Please give them a round of applause. And a special thank you to the Sno-Isle Library Foundation for making this informative event possible through your funding. Please also give them a round of applause. I would like to thank our panelists and you, our audience, for taking the opportunity to gather, listen, and to ask and learn more about this important issue. I hope you feel better informed because you were part of tonight's program. Thank you again for coming, and good night.